Gene editing for diseases like sickle cell disease have been kind of like the hottest new thing that everyone's talking about. So my big question for you is, why are therapies like that so expensive?
Well, gene editing, and in fact, gene therapies generally, suffer from a business problem. Basically, they cure you with one treatment, which means the company only has one shot to make its money as opposed to 20 years of taking their drug. That is at the core of the business challenge we have in coming up with a reasonable price.
Tell us a little bit about what you think are some of the nuances and the complexities of bringing something like that to patients.
Genome editing, which allows us to take the particulars of a gene that causes a disease and make tiny changes that will suddenly make that gene function properly, is an almost miraculous advance in the life sciences. Um, People have got many versions of it, but it's most commonly compared to a word processor where you can change the whole word in a sentence, or you could change the letter within a word. And now, increasingly, you could just change it from regular to italic font, and change how the word appears. It doesn't change the meaning, but it changes something about the tone of it, and that can change how much the gene acts. So, genome editing has tremendous nuanced potential. And for the first time, we are able to think about ways to deal with a disease once and be done. Most diseases that are like infectious diseases, you can cure, right? You treat it with an antibiotic, which was the last miracle, really, 20th century miracle, and you kill the bacteria and the disease is cured. But other diseases really have not been that responsive. Uh, so with genome editing, you have the possibility of treating this gene so that it stops malfunctioning, or it stops underfunctioning or overfunctioning or whatever the problem was. And now suddenly the person can be healthy. So, at a medical level, tremendous advance. At a practical level, not at all. And the reason is that there are so many challenges to actually delivering this therapy to people. Some of them are technical challenges. Right now, the way to do this is medically very complicated. You need to, for sickle cell, treat somebody essentially with chemotherapy, then remove their bone marrow. This is not trivial. This requires hospitalization. It puts them at risk of other problems. Then you take the bone marrow and you manipulate it in a laboratory to change the genes within certain cells in the bone marrow. Then you have to put the bone marrow back in. We're talking about maybe a month in the hospital. And then you have to wait until the new cells have repopulated. Now, at that point, hey, you've got a cure. It's incredible, right? But all of this time, somebody has been vulnerable to other diseases. The chemotherapy can leave you infertile. Many people don't live anywhere near a hospital that could do this and are simply just logistically unable to be away from work that long. So, at a practical level, this is incredibly burdensome approach. And we are watching scientists work very hard to come up with technical the technical tricks to get past these obstacles, ways to, for example, change the genes with a simple injection. Kind of for those of people who remember Star Trek, when Dr. Crusher would just press something against somebody's arm and then miraculously they're cured. But that's what they're working on, right? It's called in vivo, in the body, in the living body. Um, the other challenge is the cost, because the business model that we now have for developing new therapies is one that depends fundamentally on the following kind of pattern. Companies invest a tremendous amount of money testing out many, many things for many years. Most of them fail. A couple of them work. The ones that work get approved, then they go out into the market, and now the company is rewarded with a period of time where nobody else is allowed to get the same drug approved. So the company can charge a high price to a lot of people for a period of years and make a ton of money. And they use that money to cover the cost of the many, many things that failed, the many, many things that will fail on the next round, as well as make a profit for their shareholders. It's worked incredibly well from the point of view of developing new therapies and promoting innovation. The US has been a leader in that. Um, Arguably, it doesn't work nearly as well for people who find their drug costs too high, and that has become a burden on the public system like Medicare. But overall, that has been the system. But if you have a one and done therapy, then the company's got to make all of its money one time with each patient. One time, which means instead of charging a few pennies per pill that 200 million people are going to use for 20 years, like statins for high cholesterol, instead they've got to make all their money with one patient at one time. And so you're coming out with price tags of $3 and $4 million. Now, some of it is an intrinsic cost. There are higher costs to these biological therapies, period. I mean, the manufacturing, the quality control, it's all more complicated than it is for regular drugs. But the real issue is the business model. And we don't have an alternative model yet that would figure out a way to amortize the cost the way we get a mortgage for our houses, or to pay in advance to companies to work on these things where they get payments if it fails or doesn't fail. They get step payments along the way. But politically, very difficult to imagine giving money to drug companies for things that may not work. Just politically hard to imagine. So I think that, to answer your question more briefly, I think genome editing for things like sickle cell is a medical miracle, but a business disaster.
So, Alta, I want to pick up this issue of cost. You explained beautifully and in a very accessible, very compelling way why it ends up costing over $1 million for one-shot treatment. And when we think about it systemically, fair enough, they have to make a profit and cover their costs. As a family, as an individual, suffering from a disease that is debilitating, exceedingly painful, and I'm going to live a short life, and somebody's dangling this potential treatment in front of me, telling me that I have to come up with $2 million to save myself. What are the ethics at the individual level and as a society that we allow this to happen, of having a treatment that exists but is inaccessible because of cost? The psychological aspects of this, the societal implications, and the ethics of having something that I cannot afford.
It's cruel. It's cruel. It's like putting a meal just out of reach of somebody who's starving. It's just cruel. But it is also not limited to gene therapies, right? This is a problem we have generally. We have a world in which we are constantly making rationing choices. So let's take a look not at the United States, but at Europe, where we have national level medical systems that can think a little bit more rationally about how to decide how much to invest now in order to save money over time, as well as to think about the welfare of the population. Even in those countries, they are finding that the cost for these therapies is so high that they can't afford to do it, even though they know that over 20 or 30 or 40 years, they will make back all their money, because these people who are cured now would otherwise be in the healthcare system with repeated hospitalizations, repeated treatments, all of which costs. But the upfront cost is just too high. And so when, for example, a company called Bluebird tried to promote a gene therapy in Europe a number of years ago, the national systems could not handle the upfront hit. So there is a constant challenge of trying to figure out how to accommodate. If those countries had decided to cover this for those people with these devastating diseases, how many other people would not have been able to get all the other things that are currently covered? The teeth cleaning, right? Which, seems trivial, except that good dental care may mean that you don't get heart disease later on because you don't have, systemic inflammation. Or the, number of emergency rooms that are open when somebody has an accident and needs a trauma center. I mean, there are trade-offs all the time.
So let's go back to something that you just threw out there as if we all know what it is: FDA approval.
Okay.
About a year ago, the first drug based on gene editing ever was approved by the FDA with a price tag of way over $1 million, as you mentioned. But explain to us, what does it mean to get FDA approval? And are these cost considerations a part of how the FDA thinks about approving a drug, or is that completely separate?
To answer your question in reverse order, the FDA does not take cost into account. They're not supposed to, and it's not part of the statute that authorizes how they go about their business. So to understand this, it makes sense, if I might, to just go back a little bit in time. In the 19th century, we had all kinds of remedies being promoted. There's a reason why we have the phrase snake oil salesman, and it's because they were literally selling snake oil, along with any number of things that involved alcohol and opium, usually often in combination. So yes, of course, they made you feel better, but they didn't cure anything. We also had a time where a lot of foods were being sold with adulterants. You'd have flour that was adulterated with sawdust being put into it to make bread. So in the early 20th century, we see the beginning of this notion that there's a role for government in assuring the quality of goods. And it started with the idea that they shouldn't have adulterants. They shouldn't have ingredients that are unknown. And over time, from the early 20th century to just before World War II, we began to move into the idea that maybe they should be safe. There were a few tragedies in which some remedies that were being sold were not just ineffective, they were killing people. So suddenly, now the role of the government was to require that things be tested to show that they aren't going to kill you before they're sold on the market. It was really a very simple test. And that's where things stood for about another 30 years until we had the thalidomide tragedies of the middle 20th century. This was a drug that was widely prescribed to pregnant women and had the effect of resulting in children who were born without arms or legs or with their hands attached to their shoulders. And in many countries around Europe and in Canada, we saw a lot of these children being born like this. In the US, not. And the reason was that there was one person in the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that said, "I'm not convinced that this is safe." And what was interesting is that it led to a recognition that the word safe needs to be understood in context. Safe enough for what? So a a full artillery drug, like chemotherapy drugs, might be safe enough if it's to save your life from cancer, but it's not safe enough for a headache.
Mhm.
So safe needs to be safe enough for a particular indication, safe enough for a particular need. And that's what led to the most kind of profound 20th century change. And that was where the FDA tests not only the safety, but also whether or not something works. And then they balance the risk against whether or not it works and decide whether or not that balance is reasonable. Cost does not come into it. It's just about how serious is the condition, how risky is the treatment, and are they in some kind of reasonable balance. We've had lots of amendments since then, lots of changes in how you go about showing safety, how you go about showing effectiveness. It all involves complicated collections of what we call clinical trials. You bring people together and you will give them the drugs that you're testing in different levels, different doses, under different circumstances to try to figure out if it works and what are the what we call adverse or unfortunate effects. But that's the system that we have. It takes time. Because we didn't have children born with their hands attached to their shoulders from thalidomide, the, the United States was viewed as having the gold standard, the best possible system, because it was the slowest.
Mhm.
It was the most careful. And that was the idea about what makes for a good regulator is that they're slow. Over time, there was pressure to get drugs out more quickly. There was pressure to think about what are the costs of not having the drug in the market. And the pressure really built in the 1980s when you had AIDS activists who were frustrated at the slowness with which new treatments for HIV/AIDS was being developed, coupled with the kind of anti-regulatory Reagan-era political ethos. And they converged to put pressure on the FDA to move things across more quickly.
Mhm. So, Alta, you've spent quite a bit of time working with FDA, and I'm curious, what did you learn from that experience, and what do you think a lot of people maybe misunderstand about the FDA?
I think the thing that they most misunderstand is the mindset at the FDA. Um, I think that because there's been pressure from some patient groups to get drugs out more quickly, that there's an impression that the FDA is there as a scold, as the teacher that says, no, you may not, no, you may not. But in fact, when I worked there, I saw hundreds of people whose goal was to actually get drugs through the process. But it simply is difficult to actually show that a drug is safe or to actually show that a drug is going to work. It takes testing across many different people and not just one little group of people that all look the same. They're all around the same age. They all eat around the same diet. They all live in the same kind of housing. Instead, you need people of all types. Otherwise, when it goes out into the market, it may work for some people, but not for others. So I think there's a misperception that the reason the FDA can be slow is because they don't care about getting the drugs out and that they're there to stop it. But in fact, what they're trying to do is get it out the right way without having lots of people injured. Because when we went into more of a pro innovation, pro move to market kind of mentality after the 1980s, sure enough, we did see drugs come out that over time were shown to do things like massively increase the rate of heart attacks because we didn't do enough pre-testing to pick up on that problem. So that's the biggest misunderstanding. Um, the other thing that I did see, however, was that there is a challenge in coordinating because we have a government for all kinds of understandable reason that has lots of little compartments. And the FDA is like a little microcosm of the bigger government. You have a group that works on drugs and another group that works on devices, which includes things like diagnostic tests, and another group that works on biologics, which is not just things like blood transfusion, but also these gene therapies. They need to coordinate, but they are all working in separate silos and sometimes with totally separate statutes with different standards and procedures for testing, particularly device, which includes diagnostic and drugs. So it may be that I need to use a diagnostic to know whether this drug is good for you or not. Increasingly with genetics, we may be able to tell that your tumor will respond to this chemotherapy drug, but your tumor won't. But we've got two things going up through two different statutes, one for diagnostic devices, one for drugs, different procedures, and somehow they have to coordinate. And that says nothing about the coordination with the rest of the government and the number of ways in which things go round in circles within the Department of Health and Human Services and then within the White House in order to actually get out some kind of guidance to industry on how to do the tests so that you can prove that this companion diagnostic works with this drug. That's still a challenge. And it's one of the reasons that with every incoming administration, there's a fresh call for a new organizational approach, not only to the FDA, but to many other government departments.
And tell us something about like what it means in your view to do ethics. When you think about the ethics of genetics, the ethics of research, people may be talking about different things. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I've discovered over the years that the phrase ethics of is a trap because you have to ask ethics of what? Personal choice, the ethics of professional behavior, or the ethics of government action. And that feeds very much into policy and law. And they're different things. What might be right or wrong on a personal level isn't necessarily what the government should forbid or permit, because there are other considerations when it comes to government. And this is a challenge. People often will be talking past one another. You're talking about what you think is morally right, and you're talking about what you think the government should prohibit. And they are different conversations.
Can you give us an example of where you see this happening?
I think the most obvious example is probably the abortion debate, where politicians who have tried to make this distinction have failed to communicate that they may personally find the idea of terminating a pregnancy to be wrongheaded, but that they recognize in a diverse country, in a country that has a constitution that preferences individual choice and bodily autonomy, that it may be that the government ought not act at a legal level on this, and that the ethics of government action is one that requires attention to these other concerns. Um, So that is maybe the most profound example of this conflation. Uh, but we see it all the time. We saw it in the debates around marriage equality and what kind of personal relationships are acceptable or unacceptable. For me, maybe a very different question from what is unacceptable or acceptable at a community level. And certainly in the area of public health. During the COVID epidemic, we absolutely saw a difference between the ethics of my personal choices about going out and exposing others or not, and whether or not it made sense for the government to pass restrictions on behaviors that might have other kinds of effects, whether it's school children being able to continue to progress in their arithmetic and reading, or it's the ability of people to attend religious services. And this is a complicated area to navigate, making this distinction between what's right and wrong for me and what's right and wrong for government.
So, Alta, you're distinguishing three layers: myself as an individual and my ethical values, um, what's right and wrong for the government, and what is the layer in between as you see it?
I think that one is professional behavior. So we've seen many examples now of physicians and pharmacists and nurses who've been asked to do things that they personally oppose. It may be prescribing a contraceptive, it may be performing an abortion, it may be helping somebody to die more quickly or more gently. And we've had a huge debate about whether professionals should be entitled to say, I will not help you. There's a professional ethos about the obligation to serve all people in a non-discriminatory fashion. And we've comfortably kind of agreed that that means I can't say I'll only treat people from the same religious group or the same ethnic group as mine. But we haven't yet had a real consensus about the degree to which it also encompasses an obligation to provide any legal service that a person has competently requested. Is my obligation as a professional to provide that service in this form of non-discrimination? Or is the nature of professionalism such that I, in fact, get more choices than somebody who's a simple employee who has no choice at all? I must do what the factory owner tells me to do as I work on the line. And the two different visions of professionalism. And I think that's another area of ethics that's not been settled yet.
So let me push back just for a second. There's individuals, there are professionals, there's regulators, policymakers, government. What about communities, cultural communities, ethnic communities that hold values as a group? Does the government, do professionals have different duties when it comes to my values, not as an individual, but rather as a substantial group that represents a history, a system of values, a way of thinking?
You've actually touched on something that in the law world we find still very challenging, and it's the degree to which we can have self-contained communities within the larger community, within the state, within the city, within the country, self-contained communities that can make their own rules that bind the people within that community, but not people outside. Um, People who live in a co-op or condo are familiar with that because they will create rules for that condo or co-op complex. And some communities have done that too, neighborhoods that have rules about what you can paint your house or how much noise you're allowed to make. And people can voluntarily contract to abide by some common set of rules that doesn't apply outside. The trouble that we run into is when you have too many of those, you can create a balkanization of the country in which there are whole swaths of country that are simply unavailable to those who are dissenters. So if you have a community that has decided that in this community we are all going to celebrate certain religious traditions, and we've seen this, there are parts of the New York area where you have self-contained Orthodox Jewish communities. You have other areas more informally in the South particularly that are very, very Christian. And if somebody doesn't abide by that particular ethos, it can be almost impossible to live within that area. And so the challenge is how do you respect our collective decisions to abide by a subset of rules that we prefer and balance that against the fact that we want a country in which all people are free to partake of all the goods of the country in all places. And again, it's one of these areas where I don't think we have actually come to an agreement. And so we are fighting over these boundaries.
But when we go back to health, and especially public health, see what happened during COVID with communities demanding the right to practice, for example, as a group. And that conflicted with public health measures as implemented by the government.
Right.
And that tension was an ethical tension between sets of values that I think we're still struggling with.
I absolutely agree that we are still struggling. We have found some topical areas where there have been compromises. So, for example, in the area of public health, we have the unique problem of transmissibility. What you do doesn't only affect you, it affects me, and it affects you, and it affects everybody in this audience because you may transmit that disease if we're talking an infectious disease. So, because of that, we have an ethics surrounding public health that is far more tolerant of restricting personal behavior, specifically because it has third party effects. On the other hand, when it comes to personal choices in medicine, my ability to refuse what you think is a totally sensible kind of medical therapy that I need, even to save my life, we tend to be very tolerant of my decision to say no. That is basic to most medical ethics, in which I have to agree to any kind of intervention. And it's consistent here with what I'll call government ethics, because it's consistent with the autonomy values and liberty values that are embodied in the Constitution and in the common law about bodily autonomy. Common law meaning the casual law that we developed starting from the time that we were still colonies. The only place in the kind of medical treatment area where we limit this kind of freedom tends to be either where it's about children and or when it's about people who have lost the ability to make rational decisions. They may have dementia or some other kind of limitation. But otherwise, we respect even decisions that most people would find perplexing. Public health, we're much less tolerant of this degree of individual choice. But even there, you look back to the COVID pandemic, you see the effort in many cases to say, well, if you want to go out, you can, but you must take precautions to not affect other people. You must wear a mask. You must keep a distance. In other words, trying to find a way to accommodate the conflict between personal choice and community need.
Alta, you are such a well-known and influential figure in bioethics. And what I really love about chatting with you and working with you is just you just bring such a wealth of experience, both from law, from ethics and theory, and real-world experience. Can you tell us a little bit about what your most valuable sources of forming your perspective in bioethics have been for you?
When I was growing up, I grew up in a family that was not particularly religiously, attentive. Culturally, yes, but not religiously attentive. Um, my father had a phrase, "Be a Mensch," and for those that don't understand it, Mensch is just man, but in Yiddish. But it's basically just be a good person, and it's totally about context. It was about being in the supermarket and seeing somebody who was struggling to get something off a shelf, and be a Mensch, go help that lady. Or be a mensch and go to the store for something, and whatever it was all in the context of looking out for other people and trying to help them achieve what they were trying to achieve for themselves.
Mhm.
Whether it was turning on the television or getting the coffee off the shelf in the supermarket. And I know that in a more kind of formalized way that boils down to the golden rule.
Mhm.
But for me, it actually started with Be a Mensch.
What I really appreciate about your work is it's always so clear and so practically grounded. But if you had a bioethics magic wand, Alta, how would you use that magic wand?
I think that, as in other areas of public debate, I think in bioethics, sometimes we tend to move to extremes. And I am a centrist in bioethics as well as in everything else in my life. So, to give you an example, um, We had until maybe the 1970s what I call the aristocratic the aristocratic model of medicine. Doctors were like the aristocratic lords, and they had the obligations to do for others. They had to get up in the middle of the night, right? That was what a doctor did, to run out and give you service at your home. But in exchange, they got to decide what happened to you. And there was very little notion of informed consent or personal autonomy. I call it the aristocratic model. The reaction to that after the 1970s, partly driven by legal decisions, partly by culture, was what I call the consumerist model. Patient gets to make all the decisions. And it almost reduced physicians to the role of candy store salesman, right? Candy store owner in my neighborhood growing up would have two big things with red gumballs and blue gumballs, and I could take either one, and they would sell me whichever one I want. But I think with that came a reduction in the sense of obligation. I think one of the reasons why we have debates around, for example, professionals refusing to provide services is precisely because they no longer feel like they are getting the special privileges of being a professional that would trigger a special degree of obligation and loyalty. And I feel like we need to find this middle ground in which we accept that there are some areas that are appropriate for professional discretion in medical care, some areas that are appropriate for government discretion, particularly in public health, that these are not absolute, but that there is some balance between kind of our emphasis on personal choice and um, our ability to respect the authority and expertise of others. So part of my magic wand would be to get people out of their corners and into the center of the boxing ring and find that central or centrist approach to these things that would allow us to live, I think, a little bit more comfortably, watching out for others while we also take care of ourselves.
So, for the folks at home who are watching this conversation and hearing what you have to say, what can they do in their own lives to address some of the issues that you've raised?
Bioethics is something that everybody cares about. It's the thing that we talk about around the kitchen table when we talk about illness or we talk about whether or not to have children. So, in many ways, the most important thing people can do would be to develop a tolerance for the fact that other people may not have the same point of view. The second most important thing to do would be to start being discriminating in where we get our information and whom we choose to believe. That is a huge challenge now. The internet has made it possible for anybody to say anything and broadcast it widely. But there are times where facts are facts and vaccines don't cause autism, but we still see out there that there are websites claiming it does, and it leads people to say, I won't vaccinate my child. Um, so, tolerance and at the same time, discrimination, not in the sense of unfairness, but being discriminating in where you get your information. And that allows people to then bring, I think, a more a careful voice to these conversations, whether they are about personal decisions or about what you want your elected officials to do when it comes to passing laws.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you.